The truth most audiences were never meant to examine is this. Pasión de gavilanes was built on a fantasy of justice that demanded real human silence to survive. Behind its sweeping romance and carefully choreographed vengeance lies a quieter record of bodies overworked, identities simplified, and moral lines blurred until they disappeared into ratings success. What appeared to be a story about honor and retribution carried costs that were never written into the script, borne instead by performers, communities, and a genre that learned the wrong lessons from its triumph. The show promised passion, but it traded in control. It sold liberation, but it required obedience. And once you see what was hidden beneath its beauty, it becomes impossible to watch the same way again. Number 1. The production of Pasión de Gavilanes emerged during a volatile moment in Colombian television history, when private networks were locked in fierce competition for dominance across Latin America. Caracol Televisión invested heavily in the series, betting that a rural revenge melodrama could be reshaped into an exportable myth. What is less discussed is how that ambition quietly altered working conditions on set. According to industry interviews and union accounts from the period, filming schedules were relentless, with outdoor shoots in extreme heat stretching late into the night to meet aggressive broadcast deadlines. The pastoral landscapes that conveyed freedom and masculinity on screen were, for many crew members, sites of physical exhaustion. This pressure was not accidental. Telenovelas of the early 2000s were produced under industrial rhythms closer to factory output than artistic creation. Scripts were rewritten overnight, scenes adjusted hours before shooting, and performers expected to maintain emotional intensity without rest. While the show projected control and dominance through its male protagonists, the real hierarchy was off-camera, where refusal was rarely an option. Careers depended on endurance, not protest. The lasting consequence was subtle but enduring. Pasión de gavilanes normalized the idea that success justified silence. The genre learned that spectacle mattered more than sustainability. What looked like strength on screen was built on a system that quietly rewarded submission, leaving behind no scandal, only fatigue, and a precedent that would be repeated. Number 2. The series' portrayal of rural Colombia presented an idealized landscape of haciendas, open plains, and traditional family power structures. Historical records and media studies from the era suggest this imagery was not merely aesthetic, but strategic. At a time when Colombia was internationally associated with conflict and instability, television producers were encouraged both implicitly and explicitly to export a calmer, romanticized national image. Pasión de Gavilanes complied, offering a countryside largely untouched by the political violence that defined real rural life for millions. What remains uncomfortable is what that omission required. By erasing contemporary realities such as displacement, paramilitary control, and economic precarity, the show transformed rural suffering into decorative scenery. Scholars of Latin American media have noted that this kind of narrative cleansing did not deny violence outright. It simply relocated it into personal revenge plots that felt apolitical and contained. Structural injustice became family drama. The human cost was representational rather than immediate, but no less real. Entire communities saw their lived experiences overwritten by a fantasy that audiences preferred. The countryside was rendered safe because it had to be marketable. In doing so, the series helped reinforce a cultural habit. Violence is acceptable when personalized, but dangerous when systemic. The silence around real history became part of the show's legacy. Number 3. Central to Pasión de Gavilanes was its construction of masculinity, controlled, dominant, emotionally restrained, yet capable of explosive violence when honor was threatened. This archetype did not originate with the series, but it was refined and amplified through its success. According to gender studies analyses published in the years following its broadcast, the Gavilanes brothers represented a modernized version of machismo, polished enough for prime time, but still rooted in ownership, control, and retaliation. What is often overlooked is how little room this left for deviation. Male vulnerability existed only as a prelude to action, never as an endpoint. Emotional expression was permitted only if it reinforced authority. Actors involved later acknowledged in interviews that the pressure to maintain this image extended beyond the script, shaping public expectations of their personal identities. Fans blurred the line between character and performer, rewarding stoicism and punishing contradiction. The ethical tension lies in how influence operates. The show did not invent these norms, but it stabilized them during a period when alternatives were beginning to emerge in Latin American media. By presenting dominance as destiny, it discouraged softer forms of male identity without explicitly condemning them. The consequence was not outrage, but repetition. Masculinity hardened quietly, and television helped make that rigidity feel timeless rather than constructed. Number 4. Female desire in Pasión de gavilanes was framed as both powerful and dangerous, a force that motivated the plot but required containment. The sisters at the center of the narrative were written as assertive and sensual, yet their autonomy was constantly negotiated through male approval, protection, or punishment. Media historians have noted that this balance was carefully calculated to appeal to changing audiences without destabilizing traditional gender hierarchies. Behind the scenes, this tension mirrored real constraints. Interviews with actresses from similar productions in the early 2000s describe an industry that celebrated female visibility while tightly controlling its boundaries. Wardrobe, physical presentation, and romantic storylines were often dictated by marketing considerations rather than character logic. Empowerment was allowed, but only if it remained visually consumable. The human cost emerges in how this version of agency was internalized. Women on screen appeared liberated, yet were rarely permitted to exist outside romantic consequence. Desire led to suffering, and independence required correction. The irony is that the series was praised for its strong women, while quietly reinforcing the idea that strength must be justified through endurance rather than freedom. What looked like progress was carefully fenced in, ensuring that nothing truly changed beneath the surface. Number 5. The revenge narrative driving Pasión de gavilanes relied on moral ambiguity without moral reckoning. The protagonist's actions were framed as understandable responses to injustice, but the long-term consequences of violence were rarely explored beyond immediate emotional fallout. This approach aligned with a broader trend in serialized melodrama, where cyclical revenge sustains plot momentum while avoiding ethical closure. Historical analysis of telenovela storytelling suggests this was intentional. Clear moral accounting risks finality, and finality threatens longevity. By keeping vengeance unresolved, the series maintained tension while absolving itself of judgment. Viewers were invited to empathize, not evaluate. Violence became expressive rather than destructive. The cost of this framing is subtle but enduring. When harm is aestheticized and never fully confronted, it loses weight. The show did not argue that revenge was right, but it made it familiar, even intimate. Over time, familiarity dulls reflection. The irony is that a story built on moral injury refused to sit with its own wounds. Justice was always promised, never examined. And in that absence, the silence spoke louder than any act of retribution. Number 6. The global success of Pasión de gavilanes reshaped expectations for Colombian television exports, but it also narrowed them. Industry records and trade commentary from the mid-2000s indicate that international buyers increasingly demanded similar formulas: rural settings, passionate revenge, hyper-visible romance. What began as a breakthrough quietly hardened into a template. Producers learned that deviation was risk and repetition was safety. This had consequences for creative labor. Writers and directors who sought to explore urban realities, political themes, or unconventional relationships found fewer opportunities. Funding followed familiarity. The industry did not censor alternative stories outright, it simply starved them. In this environment, Pasión de gavilanes became not just a hit, but a gatekeeper. The ethical tension lies in how success defines possibility. A single narrative, no matter how compelling, should not dictate an entire cultural output. Yet, it did. The series' shadow lingered over subsequent productions, shaping what was considered authentically Colombian for foreign consumption. The irony is that a story about resistance ended up enforcing conformity. Its triumph closed doors even as it appeared to open them. Number 7. The physical intimacy portrayed on screen was carefully choreographed to appear spontaneous, yet production documentation and actor interviews from the era reveal a tightly controlled process. Romantic scenes were designed to balance eroticism with broadcast standards, often requiring multiple takes under intense scrutiny. Consent, while formally present, operated within a power structure where refusal carried professional risk. This dynamic was not unique to Pasión de gavilanes, but the show's popularity amplified its impact. As one of the most watched telenovelas of its time, it normalized a visual language in which female bodies were sites of narrative currency. Desire was staged, repeated, and refined until it fit expectations. The camera lingered not to explore intimacy, but to possess it. The human cost appears in retrospect. Performers later described a dissonance between public perception and private experience, between the illusion of passion and the reality of exposure. The audience saw chemistry. The actors navigated vulnerability under pressure. The irony is that intimacy, presented as connection, was often produced through isolation. What felt warm on screen was, behind the lens, meticulously cold. Number 8. Music played a crucial role in shaping the emotional register of Pasión de gavilanes. Its theme and recurring motifs drew from regional styles, lending authenticity and nostalgia to the narrative. According to musicologists studying Latin American television, this fusion was deliberate, designed to evoke tradition while remaining accessible to international audiences unfamiliar with local forms. What is less acknowledged is how this selective authenticity functioned. Folk elements were extracted from their cultural contexts and repurposed as emotional shorthand. Songs that once carried histories of labor, migration, or resistance were stripped of specificity and reassigned a romantic longing. Culture became atmosphere. The ethical tension lies in transformation without acknowledgement. While the music introduced global audiences to certain sounds, it did so without their stories. The result was recognition without understanding. The irony is that sound, meant to deepen meaning, became a veil. It softened edges, quieted histories, and ensured that nothing too heavy disrupted the flow of desire. What remained was beauty, detached from its origins. Number 9. The series' depiction of wealth and land ownership relied on inherited power structures that were rarely questioned. Haciendas appeared as symbols of legacy rather than accumulation, and authority flowed naturally from lineage. Historical scholarship on Latin American land systems, however, paints a far more complex and violent picture, one marked by dispossession, coercion, and inequality. By avoiding this context, Pasión de gavilanes transformed ownership into destiny. Conflict occurred within families, never between classes. The land itself was neutral, almost benevolent. This narrative choice insulated viewers from uncomfortable truths about how power is acquired and maintained. The consequence was ideological rather than immediate. When inequality is aestheticized, it becomes invisible. The show did not defend exploitation, but it rendered it irrelevant. The irony is that land, the most contested resource in Colombian history, was presented as uncontested. Silence replaced struggle, and inheritance replaced accountability. Number 10. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Pasión de gavilanes is how it taught audiences to confuse intensity with truth. The series operated at a constant emotional pitch, where love, anger, and loyalty were always absolute. Media psychologists have noted that such saturation can dull sensitivity, requiring ever greater extremes to sustain engagement. This had ripple effects beyond the show itself. Later productions escalated conflict, deepened rivalries, and heightened spectacle to match expectations. Subtlety became weakness. Silence became emptiness. The genre learned to shout. The human cost is cumulative. When stories leave no room for quiet, reflection disappears. Viewers are trained to seek sensation rather than meaning. The irony is that a narrative so obsessed with passion ultimately flattened it. Everything mattered, until nothing did. And in that constant noise, the space for genuine reckoning quietly vanished. Number 11. The international reception of Pasión de gavilanes revealed a fracture between local meaning and global consumption. While Colombian audiences brought contextual knowledge to the story, recognizing archetypes, accents, and regional codes, international viewers encountered a distilled fantasy. According to distribution analyses from the period, subtitling and dubbing further flattened nuance, prioritizing emotional clarity over cultural specificity. This process was efficient, but not neutral. Dialogue, rich in local implication, was simplified to preserve pacing. Social hierarchies became personal disputes. Cultural markers were reduced to aesthetic flavor. The show traveled well precisely because it traveled lightly, shedding complexity along the way. The ethical tension lies in what globalization rewards. Stories survive by becoming legible, not truthful. Pasión de gavilanes succeeded by offering just enough difference to feel exotic, without enough depth to challenge assumptions. The irony is that the more widely it was seen, the less distinctly Colombian it became. Visibility came at the cost of distortion, leaving behind an image that belonged everywhere and fully nowhere. Number 12. Age dynamics within the series were rarely acknowledged, despite playing a central role in its power relationships. Romantic pairings often spanned significant age gaps, framed as natural extensions of authority and experience. Media scholars have observed that this trope, common in melodrama, reinforces hierarchies under the guise of inevitability. What went largely unexamined was how these dynamics shaped audience perception. Older male authority was eroticized. Youth was positioned as something to be guided, corrected, or possessed. The imbalance was softened through romance, but never resolved. Consent existed within a narrow corridor, defined by admiration and dependence. The consequence is not scandal, but normalization. When asymmetry is repeatedly presented as passion, it loses its ethical weight. The irony is that the show portrayed love as transformative, yet rarely allowed it to redistribute power. Desire flowed upward, never sideways. And in that pattern, inequality learned how to look like destiny. Number 13. The series' long broadcast run required a relentless narrative churn that reshaped character integrity. Production records indicate that storylines were frequently extended or redirected in response to ratings performance. Characters evolved not through consequence, but through necessity. Moral positions shifted overnight if momentum demanded it. This flexibility kept audiences engaged, but it carried a cost. Ethical coherence became secondary to endurance. Actions lost permanence. Redemption and betrayal blurred into interchangeable tools. The story did not forget, it repurposed. The human tension here is philosophical. When identity is endlessly adjustable, accountability dissolves. Viewers learn that conviction is temporary, and principle negotiable. The irony is that a show obsessed with honor treated it as elastic. Values survived only as long as they were useful, leaving behind a world where nothing truly had to be faced for long. Number 14. Violence in Pasión de gavilanes was largely symbolic, threatened, implied, or emotionally displaced, rather than graphically shown. This restraint made it suitable for broad audiences, but it also sanitized its impact. Harm occurred off-screen, softened by music, or redirected into dialogue. According to narrative theory, such abstraction allows viewers to experience intensity without discomfort. Pain becomes a narrative device rather than a lived reality. The body disappears, emotion remains. The ethical cost is distance. When violence leaves no marks, it leaves no memory. The irony is that by avoiding brutality, the series made aggression more acceptable. It could be felt without being reckoned with. The absence of blood did not signify peace, it signaled omission. And omission, repeated often enough, becomes permission. Number 15. The passage of time has transformed Pasión de gavilanes into an object of nostalgia, often remembered for its romance rather than its tensions. Reruns and revivals invite audiences to return to a simpler emotional landscape, one where conflicts feel contained and outcomes predictable. Yet nostalgia is selective. It remembers pleasure and forgets cost. Cultural critics warn that such remembrance can freeze narratives in amber, shielding them from critique. The series becomes untouchable, not because it was perfect, but because it is familiar. The irony is that what once felt intense now feels safe. The story no longer unsettles, it reassures. And in that comfort, its unanswered questions fade. The silence deepens, not because the issues were resolved, but because they were outlived. Number 16. The revival and sequel attempts associated with Pasión de gavilanes exposed how memory can harden into expectation. When the series returned years later, audiences demanded familiarity rather than growth. Industry commentary noted that deviations from the original emotional formula were met with resistance, not curiosity. Characters were expected to remain frozen in their most recognizable states. This pressure affected creative choices. Aging was acknowledged cosmetically, but rarely thematically. Time passed without consequence. The weight of earlier actions was referenced, but not interrogated. Continuity existed to reassure, not to reckon. The ethical tension lies in how stories age alongside their audiences. Growth requires discomfort. Nostalgia resists it. The irony is that a narrative once driven by unresolved pain refused to let new pain matter. The past was preserved, not examined, and preservation, in this case, became another form of silence. Number 17. The economic model behind Pasión de gavilanes relied heavily on advertising partnerships and syndication revenue. According to trade reports, its success strengthened the argument that emotionally charged melodrama was the safest vehicle for commercial investment. Risky themes were liabilities. Complexity was inefficiency. This calculus shaped content indirectly but decisively. Storylines that threatened advertiser comfort were softened or redirected. Conflict survived only if it could be contained within personal morality rather than social critique. The market did not dictate what to say, only what to avoid. The human cost of this system is absence. Entire questions about labor, inequality, or collective responsibility never entered the frame. The irony is that a show built on intensity was governed by caution. Passion thrived only within boundaries set by profit, ensuring that nothing too disruptive ever reached the screen. Number 18. Fan culture surrounding Pasión de gavilanes played a significant role in sustaining its legacy. Online forums and fan clubs celebrated loyalty, romantic destiny, and enduring love. Yet this devotion often discouraged critical engagement. Characters were defended as if they were real people, and narrative choices excused rather than examined. Media researchers note that such identification can blur ethical distance. When viewers invest emotionally, critique feels like betrayal. The story becomes personal property, not shared text. The tension here is between affection and accountability. Love for a narrative does not negate its impact. The irony is that devotion, meant to keep the story alive, can also keep it unchanged. In protecting what they cherished, audiences helped preserve its blind spots, ensuring that admiration replaced analysis. Number 19. Over time, Pasión de gavilanes became a reference point rather than a question. New productions cited it implicitly, borrowing its rhythms and archetypes. The series shifted from being a work to being a measure. Success was defined by resemblance. This status discouraged retrospection. Canon does not invite scrutiny, it invites imitation. The show's contradictions were absorbed into the genre, no longer visible as choices, only as tradition. The ethical cost is stagnation. When a narrative becomes foundational, its assumptions become invisible. The irony is that a story rooted in disruption ended up enforcing continuity. What once challenged viewers to feel now instructed them how to feel, leaving little room for departure. Number 20. Ultimately, Pasión de gavilanes endured not because it resolved its tensions, but because it contained them. It offered emotion without aftermath, conflict without accountability, desire without redistribution of power. Its world was intense, but stable. Nothing truly broke. This stability was its most unsettling feature. Real pain disrupts systems. Fictional pain, carefully managed, sustains them. The series taught audiences how to experience suffering safely, without obligation. The irony is quiet but profound. A narrative obsessed with passion avoided transformation. It moved endlessly, but never forward. And in that motion without change, it revealed its deepest truth. Some stories survive precisely because they never allow themselves to be finished. The most haunting truth about Pasión de gavilanes is not found in its plot, its characters, or even its production history, but in what it trained audiences to accept as normal. Over hundreds of episodes and countless rebroadcasts, it refined a model of emotional engagement that felt intense while remaining fundamentally non-threatening. Pain was always personal. Power was always inherited. Desire was always contained. Nothing pointed outward. According to cultural theorists examining long-running melodrama, this pattern does not merely entertain its conditions. It teaches viewers to locate injustice in individuals rather than systems, to seek resolution through intimacy rather than change. The series did not lie. It selected. And what it selected, repeatedly, was silence around anything that could not be resolved by love or vengeance. The unsettling realization is this: the show did not distract from reality. It replaced it with something more manageable. In doing so, it offered comfort at the cost of clarity. And when the final episode ended, nothing demanded to be remembered, only felt briefly before fading. What remained was not a lesson, but a habit, a way of watching, a way of forgetting,